All right, well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you might be around the world. We're going to start in just a few moments. We want to give everybody who's waiting to get into the webinar an opportunity to do so. But I will start. I'm Eric Langenbacher. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Society, Culture, and Politics program at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies here in Washington, D.C. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and especially to our speakers. I should give a heads up that one of our speakers will actually be zooming in from France and is having just a slight delay getting on, but she should hopefully be on very soon. So today we are doing a webinar in commemoration of, or in conjunction with, Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is tomorrow, April 8th. And the title of today's webinar is Oral History, Genocide Studies, and Diasporic History, specifically the Herero-speaking apartheid refugees and the Shanghai Jews. And I'm really happy to introduce briefly our two speakers. So first we have Kevin Ostoyich, who's part of the AICGS family, having been a visiting fellow during the summers of 2017 and 2018, and currently a non-resident fellow. He's a professor of history at Valparaiso University, where he was also the chair of the history department between 2015 and 2019. He studied at the University of Pennsylvania and then went on to a PhD at Harvard University. He's previously taught at the University of Montana. He was a research associate at the Harvard Business School and an Erasmus Fellow at the University of Notre Dame. He's currently an associate of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago, a board member of the Sino-Judaic Institute, and as well as an inaugural member of the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum International Advisory Board. And I should also say a stalwart contributor and supporter of AICGS. And then we also will hopefully have Dr. Elise Pape, who was a DAD AICGS research fellow in the summer of 2017. She specializes in the field of sociology of migration and of post-colonial memories in a variety of cases such as Cameroon, France, Germany, and Namibia. And she currently works as a researcher at the University of Strasbourg with a project called Migreval, a biographical evaluation of policies that concern migrants in Strasbourg and Frankfurt. She's also worked at the University of Strasbourg as an assistant professor. She's been a postdoctoral researcher in Paris at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, and she was also a visiting fellow at the Center Mark Bloch in Berlin. So hopefully she can work out her technical difficulties. But first, I would like to open the floor to Kevin, please. Oh, I see that Elise has now joined us.
Yes, I'm here. My apologies. I finally made it.
Okay. All right. Good to see you. Okay. Well, I'm about to just give the introduction, and then you can do your part, and then I'll do my part. Okay. So excellent. What can we learn from conversation? Dr. Pape and I think quite a bit. With this project, we plan to provide individual stories and analysis of two little-known groups within genocide studies and refugee studies: the Herero-speaking apartheid refugees and the Shanghai Jews. The research for the project consists of dozens of biographical interviews conducted by Dr. Pape and myself of the Herero and the Shanghai Jews, respectively. From this vast source base of oral testimony, we wish to shed light on the following questions. First, how have the interviewees transmitted their experience of genocide or that of their ancestors over generations? Second, what meaning or meanings do the individuals detect in their experience as refugees? Third, how do these individuals view current efforts to commemorate the genocide and or refugee history of which they or their ancestors were a part? We believe the oral history approach provides important insights into these and other questions. Furthermore, we believe that oral testimony often provides a level of intimacy that is missing in standard textbook accounts of history. We are currently working on a book that will focus on 5 major themes. 1, experience and identity. 2, family dynamism. 3, dislocation. 4, commemoration and transmission. And 5, meanings. We are in the early stages of the project, but we recently have added a new twist to the project. Given the importance of conversation in oral history, we have decided to bring the histories of these 2 groups into conversation. Dr. Pape and I are doing this on 2 levels. First, by bringing our research together and discussing the histories together. And second, by bringing members of the 2 groups literally together in conversation. The 2 individuals that Dr. Pape and I will introduce today have agreed to participate in a Zoom session in the near future in which they will converse about their experiences. Dr. Pape and I will bring our own set of questions to these histories, but we are excited to find out what questions and insights the individuals bring to these conversations. As we continue with the project, we plan to set up other Zoom sessions in which we pair members from the 2 groups. So what of today's conversation? Well, Dr. Pape will now introduce the history of the Herero and then provide a brief biographical sketch of a member of the Herero group. Then I will return and introduce the history of the Shanghai Jews and provide a brief sketch of a former Shanghai Jewish refugee. Dr. Pape will then highlight some main points before we open the conversation to all of you.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, we've been working on these questions in Washington, D.C., then in Stuttgart, in Strasbourg, and yeah, really, we're really, it's really fascinating to connect these 2 different histories. Just some first contextual knowledge about the Herero and Nama genocide, because I am not sure you are all familiar with it. Namibia, or what is today Namibia, was a German colony from 1884 to 1915. It was then called Deutsch Südwestafrika, German Southwest Africa. From 1904 to 1908, a genocide against 2 ethnic groups took place and was committed by the German colonial troops. And this genocide affected 2 groups, the Herero and the Nama. For a long time, the Armenian genocide was considered to be the first genocide of the 20th century, but historians today agree that it was in fact the genocide of the Herero and Nama. Only about 20% of the Herero and about 50% of the Nama survived the mass extermination and the concentration camps that were put in place. Until today, the German government has never officially recognized and apologized for the crimes committed. Negotiations between the German and the Namibian government have been set in place since 2015, but they are still unconcluded until today. So you can see this is really a struggle for recognition that is still going on. So just to give you a short insight into how I started working on this, I started working on this when I participated in a conference that united Herero who lived in the diaspora and in Namibia. This conference took place in Berlin in 2016, and there I met several Herero who live in the US today and who struggle for the recognition of the genocide. So I'm going to give you an insight into the biography of one of these Herero whom I interviewed. But first, I just want to continue into Namibian history until 1990, so you can understand the biography better. In 1915, during World War I, German Southwest Africa, so today Namibia, was put under the military administration of the Union of South Africa. The country was then renamed and became Southwest Africa. At the Versailles Treaty in 1919, Southwest Africa became a League of Nations mandate, and it was assigned to the Union of South Africa. But de facto, in reality, South Africa administered the territory as if it was a fifth province of South Africa. In 1948, when apartheid was introduced in South Africa, it also applied on Namibian territory. At the time, as part of its policy of apartheid, the South African government created so-called Bantustans, which were territories set aside for the Black population. So there were several territories in which persons were grouped according to their ethnic belonging. So mainly through forced population displacement. And the goal was to create territories which were as ethnically homogeneous as possible. Resistance intensified in the years that followed, and in 1959 and 1960, two political parties were created that fought for Namibian independence. And in 1966, the liberation war against South African occupation broke out. I won't go into the details of the next years, but just to tell you that Namibia only gained its independence from South Africa in 1990. So from 1966 to 1990, there were long years of war, of the liberation war. So now to come to the biographical portrait of Martin Ngumaku. This biographical portrait will help to gain insights into several topics. Of course, because today we have only limited time, we'll only give you some snapshots of the portraits as we will develop them in our book. Martin was born in eastern Namibia in a Bantustan called Herero land, so these specific areas, in 1963. So you can see only 3 years before the beginning of the liberation movement. He grew up in a village with his maternal grandparents. His mother tongue was Ostoyich Herero, the language spoken by most of Herero. Martin went to boarding school, to a primary school and then secondary school, as all the children of his village. There were very few schools under apartheid, and the students had to travel for quite a distance to attend school and then stayed in boarding. Already during his youth, Martin started going into resistance against practices of apartheid. It began especially in school. For example, when white teachers would tell the students to take out their books that presented Afrikaans as their mother tongue. So the students would say, no, Afrikaans is not our mother tongue. Progressively, Martin became one of the student leaders of resistance against apartheid. When he was 16, he was expelled from high school just when he was in 12th grade, just before his high school graduation. And he then, with his family, started to try to find a new school where he could enroll, but his name had already been blacklisted in Namibia, and he could find no school where he could enroll again. So he found himself excluded from the school system, which was a very difficult and important turning point in his biography. He started working in the field of nature conservation, where he worked a few years. Then, just before he turned 20, he and his friend, who also worked in the same field, received a letter for military conscription. Both young men refused to go because it would have meant fighting the liberation movement. And from this point on, they had to flee from the country. They had to leave Namibia. as political refugees. They left the country and fled to Botswana, and there they lived in a refugee camp. They had hoped to find some education programs, but didn't find any offered in the camp where they were, and ended up living several years in this refugee camp. Finally, still at the beginning of their 20s, both left for Kenya because they found a possibility to study agriculture there in another refugee camp. So they moved to Kenya. And in 1984, Bishop Desmond Tutu won the Nobel Peace Prize for his anti-apartheid engagement. And Desmond Tutu donated part of his prize money to a scholarship fund for South Africans in exile. And actually, U.S. organizations took care of the tests and of the selection of the refugees who would get scholarships. Martin was selected as one of the very few to get a scholarship in a university in New York State in the United States. And this is how he arrived in the US in 1987. So he completed college there during 4 years. And Martin actually pursued his political engagement there. One of the red lines in Martin's biography was his engagement as an activist. So, so you could sum it up by saying, yeah, Martin was an activist. So with several of his comrades from Namibia, he continued fighting apartheid from the US, from his university in the US, and had also many discussions with Americans he met there about differences and commonalities between the civil rights movement and the fight against apartheid. So also started connecting different histories and different biographical experiences made in different contexts. In March, as I said, in 1990, March 1990, Namibia finally gained its independence. Martin graduated from college just a few months later. He decided to return to Namibia. At the time, his father was very ill and he hadn't seen his family in almost 10 years. Because of the political situation, it was impossible for him to go back, and even some letters he would send back home could put his family in difficulties. So it had been difficult to be in touch and impossible to see his family. So Martin decided to move back to his birth region in 1991. There he applied as a teacher precisely in the high school from which he had been expelled from when he was 16, and got the job. So he started working as a teacher, and in parallel witnessed a new society forming in post-independence and independence Namibia. In parallel to his teaching activities, he co-founded the Namibian National Farmers Union because the land issue was a big question. 2 years later, his father passed away, and Martin moved back to the US and settled on the East Coast, also with the goal to pursue his studies and to do a master's degree. He started working as a youth development officer in a large city, and actually he worked in a project that brought together young people from economically privileged and underprivileged backgrounds. So all his life, Martin has struggled for equality and for mixing between blacks and whites, and this is something he continued to do in the US in his new job. After his master's degree, Martin looked for a job in the US and found work in a union in the educational field in 2000. And he has worked in this union until today. So you can really see that important red lines in his biography are activism, and especially activism also in the field of education. So really the importance of being educated, which was a big issue under apartheid. This is also the moment when the question of the recognition for the Herero and Nama genocide came up more vividly. Already in his childhood, Martin had heard bribes about something terrible that had happened in the past, and mostly through his grandparents when they would receive visitors or close family members. He could hear that especially the women would tell some stories. But it wasn't very openly talked about. This was also the case in an institutional political setting, because during apartheid, it had been almost impossible for the descendants of the survivors of the genocide to publicly speak about their experience. And the energy of the Herero went into the fight against apartheid. And it was really after 1990, after the independence, that numerous Herero felt that this was now the moment where they could publicly speak about the crimes that their ancestors had experienced. So this is kind of where I'm going to have to stop. I won't be able to go much into this question. This will be more explained in our book chapters. But I'll just end with one of the citations of Martin, who actually then afterwards became one of the prominent fighters in the struggle for the recognition of the genocide. So Martin said in one of the interviews we conducted, after independence, the space was open for people to talk about their wounds from history. The wounds of different groups opened up after South Africa collapsed. And so the Herero and the Nama felt that this was their time to talk about the genocide that they experienced, because they never talked about it officially or anywhere. And so the belief was, we will get independent and we'll deal with this issue. Okay, so I'll stop there.
One thing that shocks my students when they learn this, and it may be shocking to you, is that in the late 1930s, it was actually possible for Jews to be released from concentration camps. However, in order to be released, they had to show that they were going to leave the country. And the problem for the Jewish inmates of concentration camps was that there weren't many places in the world that were willing to accept Jewish refugees. And the scramble that many of the wives or mothers had to perform in the late 1930s was to try to find some place to get the men who had been rounded up, most often in Kristallnacht, some guarantee of passage somewhere in the world. Unfortunately, most of the doors of the world were closed. And we know in the United States, for example, the State Department had put up delays on purpose to try to prevent Jews from coming to the United States, setting up bureaucratic hurdles that were almost impossible to surmount. One very strange place became then a haven for somewhere between 16 and 20,000 Jewish refugees who fled Nazi Europe. And this was Shanghai, China. This is a history that was not known for many decades after the Holocaust and has recently gained some some press, scholars have turned to this, but also there have been documentaries, most recently a documentary called Harbor from the Holocaust, which came out in September of last year by PBS. Now, more and more people are hearing about the Shanghai Jews, but for most of their lives, and the Shanghai Jews that I interview now are all at least 80 years old, for most of their lives, no one cared about the history of the Shanghai Jews. Well, what is this history? Once people learned by word of mouth that Shanghai China was an option, the scramble was on to try to get passage, and the passage could be extremely expensive. And this is a time of great duress as people are trying to figure out how in the world are they going to afford getting tickets. If they can only get a few tickets, who are the people who are going to go? And then what route are they going to take? Are they going to be swindled? I've interviewed people who were swindled of their money by people who were taking advantage of people trying to get passage out of Germany. And then what was the passage like? Well, most of the people that I have interviewed took a train to Italy and boarded a steamer in Genoa, Italy, and went all the way through the Suez Canal and so forth over the Indian Ocean to Shanghai. Others, especially if they are leaving after the entry of Italy into the war in 1940, had to go the land route through the Soviet Union, often through the Soviet Union to by boat to Japan, and then by boat from Japan to Shanghai. What did they encounter there? They encountered a completely different world, a completely different world of smells, of disease, basically all things that were distasteful. But they were free from the Nazis. And what they encounter there usually are barrack-style houses, or if they're lucky enough, as the family that I'll talk about in a little bit, lucky enough to have some means, they were able to rent a small apartment. And there they try to basically reestablish their lives in a place where they did not speak the language, where many of them had only that which they had on their backs, and were doing so until Pearl Harbor started to change the dynamics, the political dynamics in Shanghai in the favor of the Japanese. I cannot go into all of the details, but Shanghai was forcibly opened as a port city for Western trade in the 19th century. And there was an international settlement that was set up, as well as a French concession. And the Japanese had decided to try to basically gain more power in Shanghai. And then eventually, with Pearl Harbor, they took over the city. And it wasn't quite clear to the refugees what their experience was going to be now that the Japanese were in complete control of the city. And at first, there's fear of what would happen. Perhaps nothing will happen, but then in February of 1943, the Japanese set up what is called a designated area. It is also referred to quite often as the Shanghai Ghetto. This was not technically a ghetto in the sense of what was going on in the European continent, in that the Jews were not separated from the Chinese population. The Jews were actually a minority population within this designated area, and there was no barbed wire associated with the concentration camps or the ghettos of Europe. However, it was a restricted area, and Shanghai Jews needed to get passes in order to leave, if they were lucky enough to get those passes. And from 1943 to the end of the war in August of 1945, the Shanghai Jews lived an increasingly miserable life in which the aid from outside aid agencies was restricted. Also, they're living in very cramped quarters, and you see rampant disease. Also, a taboo subject within the history. You do see suicides taking place during these years, and it is an extremely difficult time for the Shanghai Jews. Then, in August of 1945, the Japanese flee the city, and American soldiers show up, and this is seen as a time of jubilation. But it is also a time that is tempered by the knowledge of what was going on in Europe, as these families realize now what happened to many of their loved ones who did not come to Shanghai. Also, this jubilation is tempered by the fact that the very rigid quota systems and closed doors around the world do not change in the immediate aftermath of the war, and it's very difficult for them to get passage to leave Shanghai. And I should say Shanghai was always seen as a temporary place of refuge. Not many of the refugees wanted to stay there, but they found the same bureaucratic hurdles were now facing them as they started going to the American consulate that was set up again in 1946, and they start applying to go get visas to the United States, or to go to Palestine, or after 48, Israel, or anywhere else in the world. And for many of the refugees, including Rudy Nothenberg, who I'm going to talk about very soon, they had to wait and wait and wait and watch others get passage somewhere else. And for many of them, they were not able to leave until 1949, so many years after the end of the Second World War. They go, and for many of them, they wish to then forget this time of their lives. And for the most part, they're allowed to forget, because most people are not interested in the history of the Shanghai Jews for the next few decades. And it's not, as I say, until very recently that people have turned to them and even have started to interview them. And they're somewhat shocked. They're why now? Why are people interested now? And for many decades of my life, no one really cared. And that is the case of Rudy Nothenberg, the person that I would like to introduce you all to today. Rudy is someone who wanted to forget his past. He said when he arrived in San Francisco, that was the end for him. He did not want to think about that past. He only wanted to think about the future. Interestingly enough, it wasn't until the synagogue shooting at the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh that Rudy started to realize that maybe he couldn't totally forget that history. Maybe that history is still part of the present. Anti-Semitism is still here. And it is at that point that he started doing some Google searches about his parents, thinking, oh my goodness, what if my mother were still alive today and she got the news that there was this shooting and people were killed at a synagogue? What would she think today, having fled and having seen the United States as a place of freedom, as a haven? So he started doing some Google searches, and he found that I had written an article that included information about his father. And he contacted me and said, I actually didn't even know a lot of the history that I learned by reading your article. And I'm willing to share my story. So I interviewed Rudy, and really for the first time, he really opened up and started to tell this story. What was Rudy's story, and what was the story of his parents? Kurt and Jeanette fell deeply in love, despite the fact that Kurt's father looked down upon Jeanette, saw that she was of a different class, and how dare his son marry this this girl. Well, love was not going to listen to class distinction, and the two got married. And they had, in October of 1932, their one child, Rudy. Things looked very good for the family. They had servants, they had a nanny for young Rudy. Everything was going fine. And then things started not to go so fine for the Nothenburg family, as well as other Jewish families in Germany. And then Kristallnacht happened, whereas Kurt's father had been tipped off and was able to hide. Kurt was not. And he was rounded up and ultimately sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. Leaving Jeanette now with the child and not knowing exactly what to do. And of course, she starts scrambling, like many of the women in the aftermath of Kristallnacht scrambled, to try to figure out what can we do. And they found out that they could get their loved ones out, but they had to show that they could get out of the country. And that is what Jeanette did. She found out through word of mouth about Shanghai. She didn't know much about Shanghai. She didn't want to know much about Shanghai, but now she wanted to figure out how to get her and her family to Shanghai. Well, Kurt was released after a little over a month in Buchenwald in December of 1938. And then the three of them went to Shanghai together, Kurt, Jeanette, and the young Rudy. I should note that later on, Jeanette was able to get her father-in-law, Max, to Shanghai as well, even though the two never saw eye to eye, and he, a proud veteran of the First World War, did not wish to go. But she talked him out of this because, as Rudy said, his mother was indefatigable. She was someone who could not be denied. And she won the battle of wills and ultimately saved the life of the father-in-law, who went but did not wish to go and leave Germany. Well, when they arrived in Shanghai, they, like many others, lived initially in a barrack, a Heime, which was set up and which there was no privacy whatsoever. And finally, they were able to afford to get a very small apartment. Things seemed to be fine until, of course, the designated area was set up, which of course started them back at square one. Kurt had tried to make ends meet by selling wool. Jeanette found a job working for an aid society. Well, things were extremely difficult during the time in which they were in the designated area, and Rudy remembers them getting kind of piecemeal work, getting kind of medicine in bulk, and then in their house putting the medicine into smaller bottles for retail sale. So basically anything to scrape by. The problem for the Nothenburg family did not stop with the end of the Second World War. And that is because Kurt had contracted lung disease in Buchenwald. So although he was there for only a month, that was the genesis of his lung condition, which deteriorated during his time in Shanghai, and then became a real problem for getting the family out of Shanghai, because by that time he had full-blown tuberculosis, and the United States did not wish to allow anyone into the country with tuberculosis. So this started a very long process in which the family had to be separated, in which Kurt had to go to the United States with his grandfather Max, who it seems did not get along very well. And once they got to San Francisco, those two split. But meanwhile, Jeanette and Kurt were still in Shanghai, where Jeanette, the indefatigable one, is trying to figure out how can she get now Kurt out of Shanghai to the United States. Well, this was not something that was going to happen. And eventually she realized that she needed to go to the United States. She was concerned about the young Rudy now living by himself as a as a 17-year-old in San Francisco. She eventually had to leave Kurt, but then still worked to try to get him entry into the United States. Kurt had to go a very long journey. He eventually was able to leave on a ship, American ship, to go to San Francisco, but he was there with 105 other refugees who were then put immediately on a sealed train and sent all the way to New York, where they were then shipped to Ellis Island. And there they had to wait to see if the United States would allow them to stay. Ultimately, they were told no, they could not stay. They did not have entry visas. And an arrangement was set up with Germany to send these 106 refugees from Ellis Island to Germany. And that happened to Kurt, where he was sent to Bremen, Germany, and there had to stay with others for up to 2 years, waiting for permission to finally be allowed to go to the United States. Jeanette, during this time, working to get passage for allowance for Kurt to be admitted into a hospital in Denver, Colorado. Once he was allowed to do that, he was allowed entry into the United States, but never regained his health. Then Rudy basically lived his life, and his was like Martin, a life of political activism. He very quickly got involved in California politics, got involved in the Young Democrat movement, then started to kind of work in campaigns, and really rose in Democratic politics in California to the point where he became deputy mayor of San Francisco under 6 different mayors, including Willie Brown. He actually then became the chief executive officer in charge of basically all of San Francisco and the San Francisco County, and is the man who's really responsible for all of the infrastructure for the city and the surrounding areas. What's interesting is that although he was the man, kind of most important person in the history of the infrastructure of San Francisco, kind of laying down the framework of the city, he himself, as a refugee, never felt totally welcome, totally at home. Always felt that his life in the United States was insecure, to the point where he started collecting diamonds, thinking that diamonds were quickly could be quickly turned into cash in case he had to flee again. At a certain point, he realized that this notion was not really rational anymore. But as I've interviewed many refugees, Shanghai refugees, they feel once a refugee, you're always a refugee, and you cannot shake that notion that at any given moment, everything that you know can be taken away from you, even your homeland, and that you can be sent away with nothing at any moment, as had happened in the past. So with that, I would like to conclude, because I know that we have many people in the audience and that you have many questions for us, and we want to engage in this conversation with you. But we hope that these 2 brief stories and the larger stories in which they're a part has stimulated questions among you. And we're very happy that you're here, and we hope that we can provide clarity to your questions.
All right, thanks so much to both of you for such interesting presentations. To those of you in attendance, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, which you should be able to see on your screen, and then I can read out the questions to our 2 presenters. But while people furiously type, I actually have a quick question for both of you. So first for Elise, you mentioned that the German government has not formally apologized yet to the I guess, survivors and their descendants in Namibia today. I know that there have been some quasi apologies or contrition expressed. So maybe you could clarify why the German government has been so reluctant to issue a formal apology, especially given this much vaunted culture of contrition and whatnot. And then to Kevin, just one thing that you said earlier on kind of stuck with me, and that is that the story of the Shanghai Jews is not very well known. And I'm just wondering why you think that is, because there have been many, many other Holocaust stories going back over the decades now that are pretty well known. So why do you think that this particular story has not garnered the same attention? But Elise, maybe you want to start?
Yes. Yes. So yes, there have been first steps. So the German government has not officially voted on a recognition, but since 2015 there have been quite some changes. Maybe the first step in this direction was in 2004. It was the 100 years and the centennial, the 100 years after the beginning of the genocide, and the Minister for humanitarian aid, the German minister at the time, went to Namibia and actually publicly apologized for what she said would today be coined as a genocide. After her return to Germany, she was severely criticized by other members of the government. But by 2015, several members of the government, for example, the president of the Bundestag, Lamotte, publicly recognized that it had been a genocide. And there have been already first formulations for an apology, but that haven't been voted yet. But one of the main reasons for this, I would say, difficulty of recognition is, of course, the question of reparation that is linked to the question of apology. Because one of the demands of the Herero and Nama is recognition, apology, and reparation. And this reparation issue is the one that yes, on the German side, wants to block this step. And I think this is a very strong European issue, because if the German government apologizes and would do some steps in favor of reparation, this would really open the door for other European countries to do the same, because there's research ongoing about definitions of genocide also in Belgium, Congo, about the crimes that could also be defined as a genocide. And in other colonial contexts, there were mass crimes that perhaps would not be defined as a genocide, but which were extremely brutal mass crimes. For example, in Algeria or in different former European colonies. So if Germany apologized and repaired, this would open actually a whole very vivid European discussion that is ongoing, but that would really have very, very large impact on Europe today. So this is why it's so conflictual.
And my answer to your question is, first of all, not many people want to talk about such experiences, and this is a generalization that holds true for basically the whole Holocaust. In that such experiences are so traumatic that people are not very willing to be forthcoming about it. But with the Shanghai experience, there are other layers that I think have worked to keep this narrative down, and is that even as there was more awareness, it took a while, of course, for the Holocaust itself to be something that was spoken about, especially in Germany, but even in Israel, it took a while before there was a growing awareness of the Holocaust as a whole. And then once that started, of course, naturally, the European story got most of the spotlight, right? in terms of Auschwitz and the other extermination camps and then the concentration camps and so forth, that naturally was the place where scholars turned to flesh out that story. And then that brought in Holocaust survivors to talk, and there were kind of venues for Holocaust survivors to talk. But with respect to the Shanghai experience, it's always been a question where to situate the Shanghai refugee experience within the larger narrative of the Holocaust. And that isn't just for scholars, but that's also for the survivors themselves. Many of them have felt somewhat uncomfortable using the tag Holocaust survivor because they tend to then compare their experience with those of loved ones who were caught up in Europe and did not survive as a result. So they feel that perhaps they would be doing a disservice to the memory of those loved ones that were lost by then claiming that they should be considered to be Holocaust survivors as well. So there's that self-criticism of not wanting to bring attention to themselves vis-a-vis those that they know that were lost. And one thing that Elisa and I have found to be something that very important that links our works is the importance of institutions in creating a space in which people can talk about this history. And it's important how institutions define this history, and that it makes certain survivors feel more comfortable. So for example, when the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum officially included Shanghai Jewish refugees as survivors, that really had an impact on the refugee community in that they have felt now more comfortable identifying as survivors. But still that tension is there. It's very palpable in the interviews that I do. There's some people who do not want to be associated with the Holocaust for that reason, but others who feel that it is important. And even within an interview that I conducted, this changed. So someone that I interviewed, he then joined me as I interviewed someone else. And when he heard the answer given to this specific question, and it was about how the Holocaust Museum acknowledged this, and that was important for this person in changing. It was when that other refugee listened to the other refugee say that, he has since told me that for him was confirmation that he can finally kind of embrace this identity, and that it's all right for him to do that, and that the important point is that a Holocaust survivor survived, and people survived in different ways, and the reason that the Shanghai Jews can tell their story is that they survived. And of course, the message that they have is important because if only more countries would have been willing to open up their doors, we wouldn't be talking about Shanghai refugees. We would just be talking about a lot more refugees all over the world.
All right, we have a question here. We have a question here from Leslie Adelson, and the question is specifically for Dr. Pape. Are contemporary Herero forms of remembering and recognizing the genocide compatible or in tension with, first, Nama efforts, and secondly, the stance of the Namibian government?
Sorry, I had some acoustic difficulties. Can you say it again?
Yes. So the question was if contemporary Herero efforts to remember and commemorate are aligned with the efforts of the Nama people, as well as with the Namibian government.
Okay, that's a very good question. Are the efforts aligned with the Nama? Yes. So that there are organizations of Herero and Nama separate but also joint, and most of the actions are actually done jointly. At least all the actions I've seen. In the US, I first wanted to interview Herero and Nama but didn't encounter any Nama on US in the US. I asked many Herero if they knew any Nama, and I didn't find any. That's why I focused on Herero. Otherwise, I would have interviewed both, because during my fieldwork in Germany, I met indistinctively Nama and Herero doing different actions. Are the actions aligned with the Namibian government? No, and that's actually a very important and conflictual issue, which is very strongly linked to post-genocidal societies. Before the genocide, Herero formed the majority population in the country. The Nama were also much numerous, of course, but the Herero were the majority group. And as a precise consequence of genocide, they are until today a minority and are almost not represented in the government. And the other groups that are today majority lived in other areas that were less affected by German colonialism, so who actually most often were not allowed, were not aware of the mass crimes committed. And so until today, the Namibian government, one can say, does not support the Herero and Nama. And this has been a very big issue, because Herero and Nama want to be included in the negotiations going on with Germany as a third party, because the government barely represents them. And this has been up to now refused. And it's also a big issue because the German government argues that it will do no reparations because it has raised its humanitarian aid to Namibia over the last decades, which is true. There's considerable sums that have been transferred to Namibia, but then Herero and Nama organizations argue that this money that has been sent to Namibia has then been invested by the government in the regions that are not mainly inhabited by Herero and Nama. So there's really it's really a big question how to build a nation after genocide, and how this nation can represent the group that experienced genocide. And this is unresolved until today, and a major conflictual issue. So thank you for the question.
All right, and we've actually come to our time. So let me thank Elise and Kevin one more time for an excellent presentation on the occasion of Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you to all the attendees for taking time out of your busy days to spend with us at AICGS. And let me also mention that we have upcoming events, including one on April 19th that will be on the Left Party. This is part of our 2021 Bundestag election series. So please do look out for our email invitations. If you haven't already, I hope that you subscribe to the advisor newsletter and look at our content, which is continually updated on our website. So thanks so much. Hope to see you again soon. Bye.